Welcome to the WanderLearn podcast. This is Francis Tapon, and in this interview, I will be talking with Rolf Potts, a complete hero of mine because he wrote Vagabonding, a seminal book in travel literature. I talk right off the bat about getting drunk when he was 5 years old, and we kind of trade childhood drunk stories between him. I ask him about when he got into hiking and rock climbing. What does he do when he's traveling in order to kind of stay in shape? I also talk about his new book, which is about souvenirs, and how does he go about buying souvenirs? What does he do? And how do people look at souvenirs versus photography? We really dive a lot into the whole souvenir topic. And also, I ask him about actually writing. Does it pay better to write books or articles? Things like that. So the whole craft of writing and being a travel writer. He's a fascinating guy. Tune in. Enjoy. Welcome everybody to the WanderLearn podcast. I'm Francis Tapon. I'm here with Rolf Potts. He is one of my heroes, the guy who has set the standard by writing the book about vagabonding. Thank you so much, Rolf, for joining us.
Happy to be talking to you from the other side of the world.
Yes, that's right. And by the way, I'm in Cameroon right now. Rolf, where are you? You're not in Kansas, are you?
I'm in New York City.
Okay, almost like Kansas.
It's American.
So you have reliable power. I have not had power for 8 hours this day since I woke up. And so I'm running on battery power. So if this interview just cuts off short, you'll know why.
All right, we're racing the batteries.
Exactly. So you and I have three things in common, Rolf. First of all, we were both born in 1970. Second of all, we're both travel writers. And third of all, we're both incredibly good looking and of course, right, yeah, that's sensationally good looking. But, Nailed it,
Francis.
But the third thing actually is that we both got drunk at a young age. I'll tell you my story later, but why don't you share when you were 5 years old getting drunk on beer?
Yeah, well, I don't even think it occurred to me when I was 5 that I was getting drunk. I was hanging out with my cousin Clint as people do with their cousins. The adults were upstairs. I was at his parents' house. And there was a fridge full of beer and pop. We call soda pop in the Midwest. This was in suburban Kansas City. And, Clint just said, "Hey, Rolf, you want a beer?" And I'm here, sure. And so we just sort of were playing make-believe grown-up, and I think we both just thought beer was an adult variation of pop. And we started drinking it, and it tasted terrible, honestly tasted terrible.
But you kept drinking anyway.
I had been taught. Yeah, because I'd been taught to finish what I started. I mean, that was just sort of like that motherly advice to finish your Brussels sprouts applied to this pop-looking can of beer, and I had no idea. In fact, it was years later before I realized what beer would actually do to you. And so, my cousin said, "Oh, this is terrible. I think I need a straw." So he went up and he got a straw, and he was drinking with the straw, and that didn't help. And I was just slowly sipping away on my beer, and then he's here. I'm going to get some salt. Maybe that'll help it taste better. And so I went upstairs to get some salt and his mom was like, "Well, why do you need salt?" It's like, "Well, Rolf and I are drinking beers." And so that shut it down. But by the time, I don't even think the adults realized it, by the time Clint had exposed us, I was done with my beer. And so shortly thereafter, the kids downstairs, we had a pillow fight, and I think I was a little bit loopy because I fell over and hit my head on the corner of a coffee table and had to get stitches. And so it wasn't until years later that I realized that beer can impair you, that I put two and two together and realized that this strange little beer drinking contest had led to my first incident with stitches. So did I beat you? Did you drink?
I think you did because you got the stitches. So you definitely, because my story was my mom was having a dinner party and she had a bunch of strawberries that she had cut up and put in a bowl, and she had coated it with some sort of liquor like rum or something like that. And my friend and I think I was a bit older than you were. I wasn't 5. I think I was about 7 or 8. And of course we were hungry, and then while she wasn't looking, we went and raided the refrigerator and we saw all these strawberries, and he's like, "Oh, yummy." They tasted a bit funny. They're kind of strange tasting, but we said, screw it, they're strawberries. We kept eating because of course we had such small bodies that we eventually got completely drunk, and we were falling over just like you were falling over, but at least we fell over on carpet. And so I think we didn't cause so much damage to ourselves.
It's funny, yeah. When you're a kid, I don't think you need to have intoxicants. You're already sort of happy-go-lucky through the world. So, did you know at the time that that was happening, or were you did you put two and two together with the rum strawberries?
I guess it must have hit me later, but I just remember looking at my friend. And the funny thing here, Rolf, is that I had such vivid memories of it. I still remember it so clearly. I remember looking at my friend and bursting out laughter, just by looking at each other. We thought everything was so hilarious that you would think that I would become an alcoholic. And here's what's strange. I have never since then drunken alcohol, except for little sips just to test and confirm that I dislike the taste of alcohol. But just like you dislike the taste of beer, I disliked it still today. I don't like any alcohol. You name it. But how about you?
Oh no, I drink. I'm not much of a beer drinker, but I drink whiskey and spirits sometimes. So it didn't cure me of alcohol proclivities.
Okay, now let's move on to your other childhood story, your mom's alabaster elephant.
Yeah, well, actually, that's my Aunt Linda's alabaster elephant.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was your mom's.
Yeah, no, that I write about in my book Souvenir. And I
Right. And by the way, let me plug your book for a second. Just that Souvenir is your latest book. You also wrote Marco Polo Didn't Go There, Vagabonding, as I mentioned at the beginning. But your latest book is Souvenir. It just came out very recently. So go ahead and tell me about that alabaster elephant from your aunt.
Yeah, well, I cover a lot of bases in the book, over the course really of 4,000 years of history and how people have perceived souvenirs and sort of the psychology behind the collection of souvenirs and the economics. And I tell a lot of memoiristic stories as well. And one thing I talk about towards the end of the book is when my Aunt Linda died in late 2015, I was at one point invited to her house to take things, ephemera from her life that the rest of her family, her children and grandchildren and great grandchildren hadn't wanted. And I ended up taking this alabaster elephant from the collection that was clearly a souvenir that she had collected for some reason. And the more I thought about that alabaster elephant, the more I realized that I would never really know what it meant. Like, to me, it's just this narrative cipher. It's this thing that reminds me of my Aunt Linda. But all of the energy that went into her possessions, I guess there's sort of this memento mori to our souvenirs, is that the stories that they tell ourselves sort of end when we go away. And another thing that I found when I was collecting the elephant was a scrapbook of my Aunt Linda with her high school friends. And they were obviously sort of these cute, popular girls. And as far as I know, all of them are now deceased. And so there's this real 16-year-old girl exuberance from the 1940s that you see in that picture. But even if I was able to track down their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they would have no reference to it. So it sort of tied a ribbon on the narrative of that book, in a sense that souvenirs, and I don't know what your relationship to souvenirs is, and I know that you've been traveling full-time in Africa for a long time. Maybe you don't have room in your life for souvenirs, but it's so personalized that there is, at the end of the day, there is no real objective meaning for souvenirs, that the personal meaning is more powerful. And in the book, I also talk about how when Neil Armstrong died, they found a bunch of workaday ephemera from the Apollo 11 mission, waist tethers and wrenches and stuff, that for all the millions of words that were written about Apollo 11, about the moon landing, these little items told a story to Neil Armstrong that resonated at a personal level that would never resonate at an official level. So somehow this alabaster elephant that I have from my Aunt Linda sort of represents the unknowability of personal experience, once you've passed on. So there's this real live while you can energy to souvenirs.
Yeah, and interesting that you mentioned Neil Armstrong, because you and I missed the landing by 1 year, and it brings up to mind your father, because Neil Armstrong, of course, astronaut, and your father was a science teacher. How did that impact you?
Well, I think he was a science teacher, but specifically a biologist. I mean, he taught all kinds of science, but and he also was an environmental educator. And so I spent a lot of my youth traveling around in Kansas while he went off on various. He was assembling. He never finished it, but it was like a guide to the natural history of Kansas. And so at a very local level, it instilled a curiosity about my environment and a love for travel, even if it was only 50 miles away from our house. And I remember him like walking his fingers across the table when we were little kids, and he's here. It's two fingers. What is it? And it's like, oh, it's a bipod. or a biped. What is this? It's a tripod, a tripod. And so basically, he just and my mom too. My mom's an educator as well. They just sort of integrated learning and curiosity into the worldview for me and my sister. And even though it wasn't really travel specific, and even though they didn't really have passports or renew passports until I had moved overseas and invited them to come see me, that attitude, I think, just of curiosity, be it scientific or poetic curiosity, influenced my worldview.
Right. And what else influenced your worldview as far as, let's say, your interest in rock climbing and hiking? Was that, because I know at some point you lived next to Mount Hood in Oregon. And was it there where you kind of got into rock climbing and hiking?
Actually, it was before. When I was living in Oregon, I was actually on the track and cross country team in college, and I wasn't allowed to do much mountaineering or rock climbing. I did a little illegally. My coach would have never. Sorry, Coach Cook, wherever you are. But when I was younger, I was a counselor at I was sort of a interdenominational Christian camp in the Front Range of the Colorado Rockies. I'd actually been actually this shows up in the book too, because when I was younger, I was a camper at that camp, and one of the things that the young boys do when they're about 15 is hike several days through the forest in the Front Range and visit this plane crash. And I had actually taken a fuse box from the plane crash, and then later felt guilty about it and took it back to the plane crash about 4 years later. But it was during that time, when I was 18, 19 years old, that I started rock climbing, I started mountaineering. And Colorado, among mountaineering nerds, is famous for its 14,000-foot peaks. And so you sort of try to collect 14,000 peaks. And I think I climbed 13 of them, 14ers in the summer of 1990. And that was mostly on weekends, because I was working, at this summer camp during the days, and then my time off. It was a very pure time of life, because I was literally hiking. I was in the backcountry all the time with teenagers, and on my days off, I would jump in a car, race off, and climb 14,000-foot mountains. And so again, before I ever had a passport, the outdoors and adventure and just sort of physical adventures were a part of my life and a part of my way of being in the world.
And speaking about physical adventures, how do you, because you have this running background and track experience, when you travel, especially for extended periods of time, how do you stay in shape? What's your secret? Or especially if you're locked up in New York City and, if they don't have a gym at your exercise routine, if you will.
Yeah, no, if you average it out, on an average travel day, sometimes when I travel and I'm stationary, I'll go running. I'm an old track and field guy, so I have running shoes and I'll run wherever I am. Although oftentimes when I'm traveling steadily, just walking every day, just getting outside and just sort of spending my day on foot, sort of absolves the need to go for a run. I remember when I was writing Vagabonding, my first book, I was in Thailand and I was pretty stationary, so I had a little route that I would run every day, and I sort of got used to seeing the same runners at the same time of day. But then also calisthenics. I actually, at home in Kansas, where I don't return to a whole heck of a lot, but I spend a decent portion of the year there. I have weights in my barn, but I don't usually have access to weights, so I just do calisthenics, push-ups, crunches.
Every day?
About every other day, and sometimes I get lazy or busy, and I don't do it that regularly. But ideally, I alternate. I maybe 3 days a week calisthenics or weights, depending on where I am, and then 3 days a week running, and then as much walking as possible. So I'm not super consistent, but in a sense, I don't really feel right unless I've been exercising. My body just sort of feels out of alignment, and so that if I fail in discipline, then just feeling bad compels me to exercise more regularly.
Great. Now we'll shift over to your souvenir book, and vous parlez français un peu?
Not really. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, but you know that souvenir is both a verb and a noun in French.
Yes. Yeah. Correct. That's tied in with memory, or bringing oneself back to oneself. How many languages do you speak?
I'm fluent in 3, French, Spanish, and English. I can get by in Italian and Portuguese fairly well because of that. And so I'm conversant, if you will, and then I'm pretty incompetent at a few other languages like Russian, and Arabic. I can say a few words, but I'm learning those languages. I'm not great at those.
Yeah. Actually, I teach a class in Paris every summer, but I teach it in English, and I'm writing in English. It's a strangely bad time to practice your French, and it's funny. I had some Korean students last year, and I realized that my Korean, years after leaving Korea, is better than my French, especially when I've been drinking soju. And so it's funny how that works. Anyway, yeah. So souvenir is tied into to memory in France, and in fact, if you go to cemeteries like Père Lachaise in Paris, you'll see the word souvenir on tombstones sometimes, which basically is just we're remembering our relative. And but it's a noun in English, and it sort of came into common use in English around the time of industrialized travel, around the time that travel became a rarefied act and more of an industrialized middle class task.
I'm curious there's one question that kept nagging me when I was reading the Souvenir book that you just wrote. It's that here's Rolf Potts, Mr. Vagabond, and then we jump to Souvenirs. And vagabonds, to me, my instinct says they're almost like the anti-souvenir people. Not that they hate souvenirs, but that just it's almost impossible to collect them because you're constantly moving. And a vagabond, I think of somebody who collects experiences, not objects. So how do you reconcile these two different interests of yours? They seem to be kind of contradictory. And you probably how do you look at it?
Well, when I went into the book, I almost felt like my personal experiences with souvenirs were a chapter of my life that had ended a long time earlier. I mean, what interested me in with souvenirs is just how ubiquitous they are. Like everywhere you go when you travel, there's souvenir vendors and sort of local people often see you as a mark for someone who wants to buy something to take home. And in a way, the further I got into my vagabonding life, the weirder souvenirs began to seem because local people, local vendors saw me. They just saw an American, a white guy walking around, and just assumed that I wanted souvenirs like everybody else. And so the less I became interested in souvenirs, the more interesting they became, because I just sort of wondered what underpinned this phenomenon. What happened when I started writing the book is that I realized that I had a lot more souvenirs than I thought. That when I walked through my house and looked at things, sometimes a souvenir might take the form of a pair of hiking boots that I wore for 2 years in the Middle East, and they evoke so much more than anything I could have bought while I was in the Middle East. Um, Sometimes they're little placeholder souvenirs. Like I bought some fairly cheap souvenirs when I was in Australia about 13 years ago, but that was right when I got my house in Kansas, and so I think I bought them just out of the thrill of having a wall where they could hang. Uh, and the more I looked, like I went down the Mekong River in a riverboat with a couple of other Americans, 800 miles. It took us 3 weeks. We went to the Cambodian border, and I saved a souvenir. I'm sorry, a boat propeller as a souvenir, just sort of a busted up one, and that's on my wall. And so I think that's not the sort of thing that you would buy at a market. It's just I wanted to keep a little bit of this adventure that seemed extraordinary at the time. And so what happened is I thought I had stopped collecting souvenirs, but in a way I hadn't. There's still ways that we mark memory with things, even if they are, you know, I guess it could be extended to a friendship or a photograph or small subtle ways that we use.
Or even maybe an email even.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I do a podcast, a Deviate podcast, which isn't about travel. It's about all kinds of things. And I was interviewing a guy yesterday about cassette tapes and how sometimes just a throwaway afternoon, maybe 20 years ago, you record yourself on cassette tape. Gosh, it's probably more than 20 years. 30 years ago, cassette tapes were more ubiquitous. And then suddenly it's a souvenir of this moment in time. It just seems like this time capsule from a different time in life. And so yeah, there's times where I'll go into my mudroom where I sort of keep some old work clothes, and I'll see this old track shirt that I wore for 2 years in Southeast Asia when I was vagabonding through the continent and not collecting things. But that's as evocative of a souvenir as anything. This shirt that I wore every 3 days for 2 years while I was not setting out to collect souvenirs. So it's interesting and it's complex, and it's really tied into how we structure memories and how associations, be they from a gift shop or from something that we wore on our feet for a year, can call forth memories in unexpected ways.
It's interesting you also brought up that shirt analogy, because I was just thinking to myself, you taught English courses or writing courses at Yale University.
Yeah, for a couple of years, 2013 and 2014.
Right. And so my question is that how do you feel, should anybody be allowed to wear a Yale sweater? Or, does it bother you to see some guy who obviously didn't go to Yale, like some bum on the street, wearing a Yale hat?
I guess because I wasn't an undergrad, it doesn't bother me. I mean, it's almost like seeing someone wearing a Yankees hat in Mongolia, and it just or and Harvard is the same way. I think any of the hype Ivy League schools have sort of become a brand. They're just an evocation of an American brand.
Well, that's the thing is that, see, I went to Harvard Business School. And so when
Uh-huh.
I see somebody walking around Boston, let's say, or anywhere in the world, and I say, oh, you went to Harvard because you got the Harvard hat or whatever. Oh, no, no, no. I just bought it at the store or whatever. I'm like, wait a second. I worked really hard to get that damn degree. and somebody
Right.
just gets that ownership. I was just thinking about the same thing with, let's say, you could have a T-shirt that says, I went on the Hajj, the Meccan pilgrimage for Muslims. That's a big deal to go on the Hajj. Imagine if I buy a T-shirt that says, I went on the Hajj, or I went on El Camino de Santiago de Compostela. That's another big deal. I hiked it, and yet you just buy the T-shirt, and you all of a sudden get membership to the club. I remember reading No Easy Day by, I can't remember the Navy SEAL who wrote No Easy Day, but he says that the Navy SEALs despise when somebody who's not a Navy SEAL wears the trident, or which symbolizes the SEALs, or a SEAL T-shirt. It's really uncool. And he did it when he was a teenager, and he learned later that that was not the thing to do. So to me, I guess going back to your souvenirs, idea is that, are there certain souvenirs that some people see as kind of like you have to earn the souvenir? You actually have to do the task before you can wear that souvenir.
Well, yes and no. I mean, we're living in this postmodern time where you can just go online and order that Eiffel Tower tchotchke without ever leaving Idaho or wherever it is you live. And so the old pre-modern or pre-modernity idea that souvenirs are something you bring back from a faraway place to prove that you've been there is no longer a same thing, because online commerce means, I mean, you even talk about military signifiers. I mean, you can go on eBay and buy things from presumably Saddam's palace. You can buy all sorts of military ephemera, and sort of build a persona around objects that you have no relationship to. So you can sort of understand the frustration of a Harvard business grad, or a Navy SEAL, or other people who are trying to contend with this. In a way, it's sort of out of the control of the Navy SEAL or the Harvard business person. It's just the condition that we're at, and as long as Harvard or the Navy SEALs are idealized, then people are going to sort of want to mimic them in a way, or sort of, again, it's almost like a fandom relationship where you wear that Yankees hat even though you're from Argentina, because it's just, that's a team that wins all the time. It's like wearing a Manchester United shirt if you live in Thailand. But in the book, I
Right.
talk about authenticity and how complicated that can be, especially as travelers, because travelers are different than Harvard grads or Navy SEALs, and there's no. It's sort of an ambiguous thing. There's people who've traveled for a week and call themselves travelers, and there's people who travel for 10 years and call themselves travelers. Yet you don't really belong to any of the societies that you're in. It sounds like you've been in Cameroon for a while, but still you're an outsider, and you could be there for 10 more years and you're still an outsider. And so this is actually a conversation among travelers, is that, and actually scholars have supported this, that first time travelers go out and they will buy the tchotchkes. They'll buy just the shot glasses or whatever that prove that they've been to a place. And the more you travel, the more travelers tend to be interested in expressions of authentic culture, be they local handicrafts or maybe something that was shared by a local host that has a personal meaning. But even then, it becomes complicated, because the old tradition of hospitality is tied in with the tourism industry right now, and so I think sort of the Buddhist concept of non-attachment to things like that is probably the best solution, because at the end of the day, I think people who have no association with Harvard are going to buy Harvard stuff, and people with no association to Navy SEALs are going to buy Navy SEAL stuff just because it seems cool. And so you might find somebody who, I mean, you might go, buy some tribal artifact from Cameroon, and that reflects a very important experience in your life, bring it home, and then realize that somebody bought the same artifact in the airport on the way home after being there for 2 years on a business, or 2 days on a business consulting trip. And what I concluded in the book is that the authenticity expressed is more of a personal authenticity. That at the end of the day, there is no real objective authenticity to these things, especially in a globalized marketplace. And so, if that artifact is a signifier of deep and important and significant meaning to you, then that's where the authenticity lies, and it's anthropological authenticity, or it's anthropology in regard to what's being sold at the airport doesn't matter, because it's about an experience that was personal. I mean, that even goes back to my aunt's alabaster elephant. That again, despite the objective meanings we ascribe to things, it becomes personal in the end, and so like the person in China wearing a Harvard sweatshirt may have got it just because they traveled to America once, and the metaphor is not specific to Harvard; it's just specific to this faraway place and to certain ideas of excellence. So it's an interesting concept, and you could probably write an entire book about the concept of authenticity in travel. Yeah. Well, I mean, you can strip out authenticity from souvenirs and just talk about how we struggle with notions of authenticity in the 21st century.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm not a Harvard snob, because I didn't even go to the graduation ceremony. I told them to send me the diploma because I was kind of in a hurry and I didn't want to stick around a couple of weeks for the ceremony. And I didn't even display it in my house. It's still wrapped up in a little tube sitting down there. So it's not like some guy's really proud and they like to put it all over and say, "Look, I went to Harvard." I'm like, no, I don't have any shirts or anything that shows Harvard. But it is funny that even though I don't advertise it, on my body or even in my house, but when I see somebody advertising it, I just assume, okay, well, you must have got to Harvard, and it doesn't happen. And there's another gray area. You talk about, the eBay thing where you can buy any souvenir over eBay effectively, but then there's also the ambiguity that rises. Let's say you've never been to San Francisco, let's say, and I give you a magnet of the Golden Gate Bridge. And then you say, oh, Francis gave me this nice little magnet. I'll put it on my refrigerator in Kansas. And then somebody walks into your house and say, hey, you went to see the Golden Gate Bridge? Actually, I never did. It was a gift from Francis. And so there's some sort of meaning that you take a souvenir and it becomes your souvenir.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes these souvenirs point towards relationships too. That that San Francisco magnet, even if you bought it for yourself in San Francisco, it's tied into your experiences there and the relationships that you made there and who you were with when you bought it. Although, interestingly enough, I just back in Kansas, I have a Seattle magnet on my fridge, and I'm not really sure anymore who gave it to me. I think maybe my sister, and so it's one of those things. And another thing I touch on in the book is that souvenirs have different resonance over time. That sometimes what might feel like a trophy of accomplishment, like I crossed an ocean, I traveled with my passport the first time. You buy a souvenir, you hang it on your wall, you put it on your shelf. Then 10 years later, you've been to 30 countries, 60 countries, and that accomplishment, it's not like it's diminished, but it's just less important in the overall scope of your way of being in the world. And so maybe that ends up in a box in your closet, or there's other souvenirs or other signifiers that remind you not just of your travels, but who you are and how you're navigating the world. And so it's funny, like there is no static or objective way that these souvenirs, these objects operate in our lives, because they change with time as we change as people, and as we maybe don't have a place to live, and as we do have a place to live, it's interesting to think about. And in fact, I've talked to a lot of people since the book has come out, and they're here, yeah, I'm not really into souvenirs, and then we'll talk about it for 30 minutes, and then they'll realize that actually they haven't thought about souvenirs in a while, but souvenirs have had a stronger role in their travels and their memories than they thought when they first started talking about it.
And that happened to me to a certain extent, because I don't consider myself any kind of a quote unquote materialist. And yet I realize after reading your book, I'm like, actually I do. There's a little bit of that inside me as well. And talk a little bit about the associational meaning behind photography versus souvenir.
Sure. Well, photography, actually this ties into the conversation I was having yesterday about cassette tapes, is that certain ways of being in the world have become non-material. They become information. Now you can buy your favorite pop song as a sound file or download it, whereas before you passed it from friend to friend via cassette tapes, or people from a certain generation, people from our generation who were born in the 70s or 80s or even the 60s. And so photos are a similar thing. Now, even when photos were objects, even when they were these things that you shot on film and got back from the photo development lab, um, they are souvenirs, but they're a little bit different than other object souvenirs in that they point something that is direct information. It's like, well, this is a picture of this mountain, or this is me and my friends in front of this monument in Europe. And so, while photos can be associational, like you may see yourself standing in front of the Colosseum with a couple of friends you made on your journey, and that calls forth associations. It's also very specific information, whereas other types of object souvenirs, the rock you picked up at the Colosseum, it doesn't. You can't hold up that rock and say, "Look, the Colosseum," like you can with a photo. It is a much more personalized and internalized meaning, and so that was an interesting thing I came across. I didn't spend a lot of time on photographs, just because photographs have changed over the years to sort of archive digital data, as they used to be stacks of physical objects. But even when they were, they're things that are not quite as fully associational as these other souvenir type objects, like even down to the T-shirts and boots and tchotchkes that you pick up that call forth stories that really you can only see.
Did you pick up any souvenirs when you hiked across the desert without much water? Tell us about that story, and if you got any souvenirs out of that experience.
Yeah, well, this is something that I ended up writing about for Salon, and it ended up being in my book, Marco Polo Didn't Go There, where I wanted to hike in the Libyan desert of Western Egypt, southwestern Egypt, just to feel sort of lost in a sandscape. There's the Great Sand Sea down there, where it's just dunes to the horizon. And so I just sort of hiked by myself there. Well, actually, I started with a friend, and in fact, the photo on the cover of Vagabonding is from that experience, my German friend Tom. But then he turned back. And as I was hiking through the desert, one thing that I found there are these bullets, where apparently Egyptians were hunting, I guess. I don't know, or they were just shooting their guns off. And so there's just like a discharged AK-47 bullet that I found in the desert. And I was so taken with it that I picked it up thinking that I might make it into a pendant or something. Then over the course of the next hour, I found like a dozen more of them. And suddenly it seemed less cool. That's sort of that weird meaning inflation that happens when something that seems dear and full of meaning suddenly becomes common.
Supply and demand, scarcity.
Yeah. And so I ended up keeping none of them, right? And now in retrospect, it would have been fun to keep one. But I thought,
you didn't even keep your water.
Well, yeah. That's how that ended up being a story in the book, is that I got comfortable enough in the desert that I had a bunch of bottles stuffed inside. In fact, they were probably stuffed inside my pack on that picture you see on the cover of Vagabonding. At some point, I threw my pack down, sat on it, and basically the bulk of my water supply burst, soaking my clothes. I wrung everything out, realizing, forgetting that I was in this classic Saharan-style desert. And so what I had to do is just sort of a survival 101 thing, which is where I just waited for the day to end, and then I hiked due east to the nearest paved road, which I knew was on the map. And I forget how long I hiked now, maybe 10 hours or something. I hiked through the night, got to the road and hitchhiked home. In retrospect, it's easy to talk about it in a glib way, but it was a very nerve-wracking experience that I had just stupidly, squandered my water and sort of had to aquavac, not medevac, but aquavac myself out of the desert. And then, just the specter of a pasty, freckled American standing on the side of the road got me a free trip back to civilization. And so it makes a good story. I wouldn't advise it, but it makes a good story. And I have no souvenirs except the story itself.
Now, speaking about North Africa, let's talk a little bit about the Muslims. I'm just curious, this is going to be a tricky question, whether you think Muslims are less obsessed about souvenirs. And I'll break that down a little bit in case that's not obvious. Now, idols are objects that we've imbued with meaning, and we revere idols. And especially if you look, one of the things that Muslims do is that they really don't idolize anything, and they're very strict about it. Now, in the Bible, it says clearly you're not supposed to idolize anything, but you go to any Orthodox Christian church and there's idols all over the place. In fact, almost every single Catholic church, same thing. And so I was just curious if maybe in your investigations about souvenirs for your book, if you found out that Muslims or in your travels, let's say either in Egypt or elsewhere, that you found that they were maybe less souvenir oriented, or just you found no difference at all, or you don't have enough data points to know?
I don't know if I have enough data points. I have some anecdotal reflections. I mean, it's the whole graven images thing. I think that goes back to the old Jewish scriptures, back when the pagan tribes were worshiping Baal. And somehow it didn't translate to the Orthodox tradition, maybe because it sort of integrated with other pagan traditions in that part of the world, Christianity at least. And so while that never occurred to me, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are less, quote, graven images in the homes of Muslim people. But I know that during the Hajj, going way back, and there's a spring, and I forget, it starts with a Z, I forget the name of it exactly, it's in my book. And there was a brisk trade in souvenirs of just little water jugs to put water from the holy spring in this jug and take it home. And so I think I have no empirical data to underpin this, but I think that everybody likes to have some sort of memento of where they've been. And so I would suspect that, like the Hajj, for example, has different kinds of souvenirs. I mean, there's even the white skull cap. Doesn't the white skull cap indicate that you're a Haji?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. They changed their name. I know they called people like Al Hajj. When you've gone on the Hajj, you become like, it's not just Mr. Potts. It's like Al Haji Potts. So things like that happen. But I don't know if there's. They must have some other souvenir that shows that they've done Mecca.
Well, I know that there's rugs, there's handicrafts, and so were I to speculate, it's probably not. They're less likely to buy, a little statue that represents some place that they've been, but they might buy a vase or a rug or something like that.
Or a magnet.
Or magnets, sure, yeah. And then again, I it's not like in my travels, being the home of Muslims, they seem like they have less things hanging on the wall or sitting on the shelf. And so I think in principle, there's that idea of non-representational art and avoidance of graven images. But in practice, I think that they end up enjoying little tchotchke souvenirs, little reminders, a rug from the market that they went to before, as much as anyone else. Have you experienced otherwise?
No, I agree with you. Overall, I would say that my guess is that they are a bit less souvenir focused, but not dramatically so. And certainly, like you say, when it comes to like little statues, like they probably wouldn't buy, let's say, an Egyptian statue knockoff in alabaster that shows, let's say, the Sphinx. Maybe they would say, no, I won't buy that. But they might buy a poster of the pyramid.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, the art. I mean, there's these great tile traditions, these more abstract tile traditions from Islamic art, and so I think there's ways around it, and so I think you're right. I'm forever. I'm going to be paying attention to this now. Now that you brought it up, I didn't look at it specifically for the book, but now I'm going to be curious. So the next time I travel in the Muslim world,
well, you did the opposite for me. I never thought about it until I read your book, and I was like, now I got to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
So, what about? Last question about the souvenir book. Now I'm a writer too, and I know how it is, right? When you finally say, okay, print, and you're finished with the article or with the book, then you immediately have regrets and you start looking at it again. So what would you update or change? I know it's brand new, it just came out, but there's probably already things that you say, damn it, I should have included this or that or said this differently. Anything that comes to mind?
I think I overlooked the extent to which workaday souvenirs are a part of our lives. Like I scoured my house, well, like cups from sports stadiums or from Mardi Gras or beer steins from Oktoberfest. Because I scoured my house. I did reporting in Namibia and in Paris and in vendors convention in Las Vegas for the book. But I also very carefully picked over my house, and I found a lot of things that I had forgotten that I had collected as souvenirs. What I didn't do is check my cabinets, and so it has been after the book has come out that I've realized that I have this wealth of associational memories because I have that Kauffman Stadium cup from the year the Kansas City Royals won the World Series, or I have that beer stein from the Oktoberfest that I went to in Queens and that I won because I knew that Stavropraven beer was not German but Czech, and these little shot glasses, which I rarely use, but somehow became things that I bought. So it's funny how there's some souvenirs that you display or hang on walls or even put in storage, and then there's some that just become vessels through which you drink your orange juice in the morning. And I forgot to check those, um, and so I think that that's at least 5 pages just sort of talking about how when I open my cabinet, suddenly there's this geography of association just based on plastic and glass cups and glasses.
That's amazing. Well, I appreciate summing that up. Now we've gone through your childhood, gone through the souvenir book, and then the last part of this discussion that we're having, I want to talk about the business of travel writing. In other words, the nuts and bolts. And I'll get right to the point on one issue. I'm just curious about, since you've done both articles for all sorts of high-end magazines, for well-known magazines, as well as books. You've written several books. What have you ever sat back and calculated, Roth, what nets you a higher hourly rate? I realize that's really hard to calculate because books, you're still getting paid royalties for the Vagabonding book, even though you wrote that 15 years ago or so. So it's hard to calculate versus an article that you wrote for the New Yorker, it pays once and then it's done. You don't get royalties on that. But do you have a sense, like if you were to calculate your time, energy, payoff, that kind of stuff, do you get a better bang for your buck and your time and your word for articles or for books, or is it hard?
Well, it depends on how well the books do. So I would say if you're getting paid well, if you're getting paid glossy rates, which is rarer and rarer these days, then you can outstrip a book for sure. Because you can make thousands of dollars off of a good glossy or even like a New York Times type byline. Although if you buy a book that is perennially successful like Vagabonding is, then there's no comparison. I've sat back and done pretty well from Vagabonding over the years, and of course I guess that's become a part of my platform, and so it's hard to judge where the work has stopped for Vagabonding because I talk about it a lot. I mean, and that's led to college speaking fees and non-college speaking fees and all sorts of opportunities that are hard to calculate. But then there's also this assumption that the glossy magazine article is something that is sort of a static standard. I think that a lot of savvy travel writers, or even you might even call them bloggers these days, are finding ways to monetize their content and really brand themselves in such a way that they're not beholden to editorial standards. And so I haven't gone too far in that world. I've done some of that. I haven't monetized very much of it. But it really is sort of an old bricks and mortar idea that you're pitching to editors and you're getting $1 or $2 a word. Whereas some people, in the way that you might invest in a book like Vagabonding, they're investing in their special blog that might dispense a lot of travel advice, tell some stories, might sell some products, and that travel writers have in effect become personal businesses where they might parlay their blog into a guide service and a keynote speaking service. And so it's just a lot more complicated than it was, maybe in the 1990s when I was first starting to think about this business. And so I guess my living comes through a combination of all of it, and it really depends on the year which kind of income is predominant over the other.
Another question I was curious about is that you've written a few short books. For example, you've got Vagabonding is not that long. The souvenir book is 144 pages. And I am plagued by this verbal diarrhea. I write just really long books. My last book was 330,000 words, 750 pages or whatever. And so I really envy you. I'm like, how are you able to do this? And yet I was kind of researching you and I realized that Kurt Vonnegut would call you a basher, and I'm a basher. I'm not a swooper. You're not a swooper. And basically, for those who don't know those terms, a basher is somebody who just is a perfectionist. They can't move on to the next paragraph or even the next sentence before the last paragraph is perfect, and they can't. Versus a swooper just writes it all out and revises ad infinitum. So my question to you, Rolf, is how do you manage to decide what percentage of the raw words get cut, or how do you decide what to cut out? Because you must be good at cutting things to be able to write some concise books. I'm not good at that, so I'm trying to figure out what's your secret.
Yeah, well, I think bashers sort of bash their way into ideas. We go one sentence at a time, and by the time we've written our 30th sentence, the first sentence has been rewritten 6 times. And by the time we get to our 500th sentence, the first sentence has been rewritten 50 times.
Yep.
And so A book like Souvenir had a very specific. It's a prescribed short book. It's part of a series where none of the books are more than 144 pages long. Whereas Vagabonding is a book where I wrote it until it felt like it was done, and that worked out really well for me. I think I was 30 years old when I started that, and 31 when I finished. Um, and if I had tried to write that now, I might be more erudite. I might have more travel experiences to draw on. But I don't think it would work as well if it was a 400-page book instead of a 200-page book. I think sometimes, the right balance is what counts. Um, and so, weirdly enough, oftentimes my super long stuff is not as well received as the shorter stuff. So I think it's just about the right touch and just sort of knowing the bandwidth of your audience and when you've made your point and can call it successful. And that was almost something that happened. I don't know if it's by accident or by intuition with Vagabonding, but even though I have broader knowledge in a sense, there was something about just sort of that energy and excitement that went into the book, that light touch, I think, was more important than adding another 100 or 200 pages.
Got it. And speaking about your book, Vagabonding, is there anything you would update there? I mean, because you said you've had all sorts of new experiences. You wouldn't want to touch it?
No, I mean, I did an update in 2016, and Tim Ferriss had done he produced an audio version of the book with a foreword, and so I included his foreword in the print, or a preface in the print edition, and I updated some of the language because people don't use CD-ROMs anymore. Poste restante is not very common. There were just some dated information, and the resources even though the resources were updated online, I wanted to make sure and get those into the print edition too. But the content itself, I really didn't change anything. I think so much of what was in Vagabonding was sort of philosophical stuff that hasn't really changed. The philosophies that underpin Vagabonding are the same. The idea that you need to let your life pay out in time, wealth, and experiences is something that holds as true now as it did when I finished writing the book in 2002, 2003.
What about your next book?
That's a good question, actually. People keep asking me about that, and I'm not sure. I'm an idea hoarder, so I have 10 ideas for books, and screenplays and other projects, and I haven't pulled the trigger yet. I'm still sort of in the wash of spending time in New York, promoting my new book. I have some travels coming up that will take me back to Kansas and to the West Coast, and it'll probably be May before I can really relax and sort of get on top of things and think about where I want to go next creatively. So that's actually an exciting prospect that I don't know yet, but I'll get to go through the process of deciding where I want to focus my energies.
And speaking about focusing energies, I don't really understand sometimes why more successful authors like yourself don't self-publish. It's kind of like if Madonna, for example, wants to put out an album, or J.K. Rowling wants to write another book, she doesn't really need a publisher. They don't need these publishers anymore, and you can just self-publish so easily nowadays. And I'm just so surprised that people who already have a big platform and a following, why they don't go down that route, given the ease of self-publishing nowadays. What's your belief on that?
Well, I think a book like Souvenir is part of a series, and I just liked it. Sometimes I joke that it's my midlife crisis book, but it was fun to be I didn't do that for money, right? I wrote that book just because I liked the thought experiment. I liked the exercise of the deep dive, the research of writing about souvenirs. I think if I had a more practical book, and actually one of the books on my list is more practical, then self-publishing is definitely something I would consider, because it's a matter, again, just like some bloggers are able to leverage their blogs and tie-ins to make pretty good money. I think self-publishing books is a way to make more, really to cut out all the middlemen. I mean, Random House published Vagabonding, and that's great, and it was a time when a platform like that was great. But at the end of the day, Random House has made a lot more money from Vagabonding than I have. And so if I write another Vagabonding equivalent, a very specific applied life advice type book, the chances are very strong that I would not only self-publish it, but probably transfer the savings to the reader too. That I could write, if I wrote a book with a lot of useful advice and was able to sell it for $6 instead of $16 and make decent chunk of that $6, then I can just transfer the savings, just make it easier for the person to buy that book and get that advice. So again, it's something I haven't pulled the trigger on, but it's something that I will do when the time is right. And there's certain projects that I would, if I did something memoiristic or repertorial, I would probably go with a traditional publisher. If I do something that is applied, that is involved with life advice, then there's a very strong chance that my next book that is in the vein of Vagabonding will be published by me.
Excellent. I look forward to that next book of yours, self-published or not. More importantly, the most important question is, have you taken mushrooms?
Not yet. You obviously listen to my podcast with Ari, and I've joked with him about that. But the secret plan for that is later this spring. So we'll see how I do.
Okay, the secret plan, as you tell everybody.
Well, I don't want a bunch of people to show up from my Shroom Fest, just to ogle me like a museum piece. But I promised Ari I would do it, so that will go down sometime this spring.
There's two experiences I've had with shrooms. One was in Amsterdam, and it was completely legal. It was before they banned them, I guess, in Amsterdam. And they just had a giggle fest. But the second time I took it, it was at Burning Man. And there I had a completely different experience, one of great, intense empathy. It was so strange. No laughing, no giggling, but just an insane amount of empathy. So it'll be interesting to see what flavor of mushroom and what effect it has on you.
Yeah, I have no idea, but I've been reassured that it's going to be fine. And I'm doing it in like a controlled and beautiful environment, so that I can enjoy it and add that experience to my life experiences.
Well, you've added a lot to my life experiences, Rolf. In 2001, I did the Appalachian Trail, and I decided then I was going to do vagabonding. And then your book came out, and that kind of just reinforced my belief. And I realized, shit, I'm not that crazy, actually. I'm not the only crazy idiot out there who likes to do this kind of nonstop travel stuff. And it kind of gave me the confidence to keep going down that path. And I think you've inspired me, you've inspired many people to do that. And I really want to thank you for that, because did the Appalachian Trail, then I did the Pacific Crest Trail, then I went from Canada, then I did the Continental Divide Trail. I walked from Mexico to Canada and then back down to Mexico. And then I went vagabonding for 3.5 years in Eastern Europe, wrote a book about that. Then 5 years in Africa, all these things. Oh yeah, I walked across Spain twice, walked across Madagascar. So all these things. And I can't give you all the credit, but definitely you deserve credit for having inspired me and confirmed that these are experiences worth having. So thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm actually jealous of a lot of that stuff. You've outpaced me, especially in the hiking world. So it sounds like you were an early adopter. If you got the book in the early 2000s, it must have been pretty new.
Yeah, I think it was 2000. Because see, I did my first trip to Eastern Europe was 2004, and I think it was already out by then, if I remember correctly, or maybe because I did the Pacific Crest Trail in 2006, and then I did the Continental Divide Trail in 2007. That was a round trip thing. But yeah, it was just nice to read about it and like, okay, somebody else gets it. It's not just me out there. And I think a lot of people who are listening to this podcast might be in a similar boat. They may either be before they pull the trigger, or they've just pulled the trigger and they're still a little bit insecure about what they're doing and about their job situation or whatever. And this kind of gave me the courage to just let it all out. And since 2006, I worked for Microsoft in 2006. That was my last honest job. And since then, I've just been going nonstop. And one of the things I struggle with personally is just the dilemma between, how much time to spend promoting and writing and stuff like that versus just continuing to travel. And I don't know, you must struggle with that too, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I'm jealous of your travels right now, that you're in Cameroon and I'm in New York. I love New York, but there's something sort of more awesome sounding about Cameroon. And so it's that trade-off. I've been doing a lot of writing, a lot of book promotion. I've done teaching. I have, my Yale years happened after all of my vagabonding stuff. And so, but yet that's an important and meaningful time of my life too. So, it is a trade-off, and I think it's just good to acknowledge that the blessing of having those sorts of options. Should I sit in the house that I love and write another book, or should I go travel the world? And so
exactly, that's the challenge. And that concludes this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel technology and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we talked about, or if you'd like to comment on the show, or if you'd like to ask me a question, then go to WanderLearn.com and click on the latest episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is the username I use on all social media. You can also get to my website by going to ftapon.com. Here's one last reason to remember Tapon. If you like what I do and want to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ yep, you guessed it, ftapon. That's where you can pick up some sweet rewards for as little as $1 a month. And remember, subscribing to the WanderLearn podcast helps, but downloading each episode helps even more. Please share the podcast, review it, and sign up for my newsletter at wanderlearn.com. This show was edited by Rejoice Tapon. The music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.